When my dad and I moved into the small apartment, it was supposed to be a temporary solution while our house underwent renovations. The apartment complex was quiet, with most neighbors keeping to themselves. Life was uneventful, except for one family that lived a couple of doors down from us. The family consisted of a mother and her two adult children, a son and a daughter, both in their 20s. From the moment we moved in, it was clear that their household was far from peaceful. Their arguments were frequent and loud, often spilling out into the common areas of the complex. The son, a tall, muscular guy with a constant scowl, and his sister, a petite woman with an equally fiery temper, were always at each other's throats. Their mother, a weary-looking woman with dark circles under her eyes, often tried to mediate, but her efforts were usually in vain. Despite the frequent disturbances, my dad and I tried to mind our own business. After all, we were only going to be there for a few months, and it didn't seem worth getting involved in someone else's family drama. But all of that changed on one sunny afternoon when the arguments escalated into something far more dangerous. I remember the day vividly. It was a lazy Saturday, and I was in my room trying to focus on a book I'd been meaning to finish. My dad was in the living room tinkering with some electronics, his favorite pastime. The usual sounds of the apartment complex, distant conversations, footsteps, the hum of appliances, provided a comforting background noise. Suddenly, the familiar sound of yelling pierced the tranquility. I sighed and tried to ignore it, thinking it was just another one of their routine arguments. But this time, the yelling was different, more urgent, more desperate. I put down my book and walked over to the window, curiosity getting the better of me. What I saw next made my blood run cold. The mother and daughter were outside, backing away from the building with terrified expressions on their faces. The son was following them, his face twisted in rage, and in his hand he held a large kitchen knife. He was shouting something unintelligible, but his intentions were clear. "Dad! Dad!" I yelled, my voice cracking with panic. "Come here, quick!" My dad rushed to my side and looked out the window. His eyes widened as he took in the scene. Without a moment's hesitation, he grabbed his phone and bolted for the door. I followed close behind, my heart pounding in my chest. By the time we reached the footpath outside, the situation had escalated even further. The son was now only a few feet away from his mother and sister, who were backed up against the wall with nowhere to go. My dad, who had always been a man of action, didn't waste any time. He lunged at the son, grabbing his arm in an attempt to wrestle the knife away. "Call the police!" he shouted over his shoulder at me. I fumbled with my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed 911. My dad and the son were now locked in a struggle, the knife glinting in the sunlight as they fought for control. The mother and daughter watched in horror, too stunned to move. 911, what's your emergency?" The operator's voice crackled through the phone. "There's a man with a knife attacking his family. My dad's trying to stop him. We need help now," I blurted out, giving our address as quickly as I could. The operator assured me that help was on the way, but every second felt like an eternity. I watched in terror as my dad managed to pin the son to the ground, finally prying the knife away from his grasp. The son, surprisingly, didn't resist much after that. He laid there, breathing heavily as my dad yelled at him to stay down. Moments later, the sounds of sirens filled the air, and several police cars screeched to a halt in front of the complex. Officers rushed out, guns drawn, and quickly took control of the situation. They handcuffed the son and led him away, still seething with anger but not putting up a fight. The mother and daughter collapsed to the ground, sobbing with relief. My dad, his face pale and his hands trembling, handed the knife over to one of the officers. I stood there, still clutching my phone, feeling a mixture of fear and admiration for my father's bravery. One of the officers approached us and took our statements. The mother, once she had composed herself enough to speak, explained that her son had severe anger issues. She told us that he had been struggling for years, and that this wasn't the first time he had become violent. She expressed her gratitude to my dad for stepping in and possibly saving their lives. As the police drove the son away, I couldn't help but feel a sense of uneasiness. What if he came back? What if the situation escalated even further next time? These thoughts swirled in my mind as we returned to our apartment, the adrenaline slowly wearing off. For the next few days, the apartment complex was unusually quiet. The usual sounds of life had been replaced by an eerie silence, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The mother and daughter kept to themselves, rarely leaving their apartment. About a month later, we noticed the son had returned. He looked different, more subdued, almost resigned. The mother had mentioned that he was undergoing treatment, but it was hard to believe that a month away could make such a drastic change. Surprisingly, there were no more arguments or yelling matches. The family seemed to have settled into a fragile peace, and the complex slowly returned to its normal state. But the incident had left a lasting impression on me. It was a stark reminder of how quickly life could change and how important it was to be prepared for the unexpected. As for my dad and I, our bond grew stronger after that day. I had always admired him, but seeing him in action, risking his own safety to protect others, made me realize just how lucky I was to have him. Our time in the apartment was temporary, but the lessons we learned and the experiences we shared during those months would stay with us forever. Eventually, the renovations on our house were completed, and it was time to move back home. As we packed up our belongings and prepared to leave the apartment, I couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. The apartment complex, once just a temporary home, had become a place of growth and learning for me. I looked out the window one last time, taking in the familiar view of the footpath and the rows of connected houses. The memory of that fateful afternoon was still fresh in my mind, but now it was tempered with a sense of resilience and hope. Life was unpredictable, but with my dad by my side, I knew that we could face whatever challenges came our way. As we drove away, I glanced back at the apartment complex, a small smile playing on my lips. It had been a place of turmoil and fear, but also of courage and strength. And I knew that no matter where life took us next, I would always carry those lessons with me, ready to face the future with a newfound sense of confidence and determination. My name is Bob, and I've been a fan of this channel for a long time. I'm an older viewer, probably a lot older than most. I'm almost 70 years old now, but the story I want to share happened when I was just 10 years old. Back in the summer of 1964, I had a job delivering milk around my neighborhood. Yes, I'm that old. It was a quiet suburb with neat lawns, picket fences, and cozy homes. Every morning before dawn, I would load my bicycle with clinking glass bottles and pedal through the serene streets. One thing that set our neighborhood apart was the mysterious Mr. Franklin, who lived at the end of Elderberry Lane. His house was an old Victorian with dark curtains always drawn. Rumors said that he rarely came out during the day, preferring the cover of night for his activities. I first noticed Mr. Franklin during my third week on the milk route. After leaving milk on Miss Thompson's doorstep, another local in the neighborhood, I felt a shiver down my spine. Turning around, I saw him, Mr. Franklin, standing in his overgrown garden, his pale face framed by messy gray hair. His unsettling smile made my heart race. From then on, I always felt his eyes on me during my deliveries. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of him behind his curtains or see his figure under a street lamp. It seemed that he was always watching but never approaching. As time passed, Mr. Franklin's presence became more real to me. My bike would be moved, or I'd hear footsteps behind me in dark alleys. One foggy morning, I saw him standing far away under a streetlight, his smile directed not at me but at something behind me, a chilling sight that made me spin around in fear. Fear became my constant companion. I started taking different routes and avoiding quiet corners where Mr. Franklin might be lurking. Despite my efforts, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. One hot afternoon, seeking refuge from the heat in an abandoned warehouse, I overheard two men talking about Mr. Franklin. They spoke in hushed tones, warning each other about his collection of photos and letters about people in our neighborhood. More specifically, some of the children. They said he watched everyone closely and that they needed to keep an eye on him. That night, I couldn't sleep. The thought of Mr. Franklin's obsession with collecting information about us gave me the chills. Finally, determined to confront him, I set out on my milk route at dawn the next morning. Pedaling down Elderberry Lane, I gathered my courage and knocked on his door. "Come on in, boy," Mr. Franklin's voice called from inside in a tone that was both kind and menacing. Mentally preparing myself, I entered his house. The air inside smelled musty, like old books, and the walls were lined with shelves filled with files neatly labeled with names of people I knew from the neighborhood. Mr. Franklin sat at a cluttered desk beneath a dusty chandelier. His smile, when he turned to face me, was eerie, yet carried a hint of anticipation. "You've been watching me," I accused, my voice trembling. Mr. Franklin's smile widened. "Watching? Yes. But don't worry, I'm not just watching you, my boy. I watch them all," he said, gesturing to the files around us. He explained that he was an observer, a collector of stories and lives, trying to understand and capture the essence of what it meant to be alive. His words carried a strange longing, a desire to connect with lives passing by unnoticed. At this point, I was absolutely horrified and wanted out of his house immediately, but curiosity got the best of me. "Why?" I managed to ask, struggling to grasp his obsession. Mr. Franklin looked at me with a mix of disappointment and resignation. "I want to know, to understand," he said softly, "to possess something of the lives that surround me." With a newfound resolve, I declared that I wouldn't be part of his collection. Mr. Franklin nodded sadly and, with a wave of his hand, allowed me to leave. Walking away from Elderberry Lane that morning, I felt relieved yet haunted by the weight of Mr. Franklin's gaze. Over the years, the neighborhood changed, replaced by modern streets and buildings, but the memory of Mr. Franklin and his unsettling obsession remained etched into my mind, a reminder of how darkness can hide beneath ordinary facades. Though I've moved on and built a different life for myself, there are nights when I find myself staring into the darkness, half expecting to see Mr. Franklin's figure with that unsettling smile. I've always been good at blending in, at becoming part of the background. It's a skill that served me well over the years, especially now as I watch her, the young woman in apartment 3B. From my vantage point across the courtyard, behind the safety of drawn curtains and a partially open window, I observe her daily routines with a mix of fascination and longing. And if by now you couldn't already tell, this is a different kind of story, the one where I'm the creeper. She doesn't know me, not really. To her, I'm just another face in the building, perhaps a neighbor she passes in the hallway or nods to in the elevator. But to me, she is my everything. Her name is Sarah. I learned that from the mailbox one afternoon when I chanced to see her retrieve her mail. Sarah, with the easy smile and the infectious laugh that echoes down the corridor on occasion. I know her schedule almost as well as my own. In the mornings, she emerges from her apartment at precisely 7:45, dressed for work in smart blouses and pencil skirts that accentuate her figure. She carries a sleek black briefcase and often stops by the coffee shop on the corner before disappearing into the throng of the city's morning rush. I've imagined countless scenarios where our paths might cross naturally, perhaps at the corner cafe, where I could strike up a casual conversation about the weather or the latest news. But I know better than to risk the fragile fabric of my carefully constructed reality. No, it's safer to remain in the shadows, to watch and to wait. During the day, I occupy myself with mundane tasks. An errand here, a trip to the grocery store there. All the while keeping one ear tuned to the hum of life in the apartment complex. Occasionally, I'll catch glimpses of Sarah through the frosted glass of her kitchen window as she prepares dinner or unwinds after a long day. Nights are the hardest, when the silence of the building presses in around me like a suffocating blanket. That's when I find myself drawn to the window, drawn to the faint glow of light from apartment 3B. Sometimes she reads, curled up on the couch with a book held close to her chest. Other times, she watches television, the flickering screen casting shadows across her face. I wonder what occupies her thoughts during those quiet moments. Does she think of me, the faceless neighbor who watches her from across the courtyard? Or does she go about life oblivious to the silent presence that hovers on the periphery of her world? I've tried to rationalize my obsession, to convince myself that it's harmless, that it's merely a passing fascination. But the truth is far more insidious. I can't tear myself away from her. The need to know her, to understand her, consumes me in ways that I just can't explain. Tonight is no different. As I stand at the window, the darkness outside broken only by the soft glow of streetlights, my gaze inevitably drifts to apartment 3B. I see movement, a flicker of light that draws me closer to the glass, my breath fogging the window pane. She's there, framed against the lamplight from the living room, her silhouette ethereal and distant. There's a vulnerability about her in these moments, a rawness that she only reveals when she thinks no one's watching. And yet, I'm watching. I'm always watching. Suddenly she turns, as if sensing my gaze from across the courtyard. My heart lurches in my chest, and for a fleeting instant, our eyes meet through the glass. Panic surges through me, threatening to unravel the fragile threads of my carefully constructed facade. But then she smiles, a small, knowing smile that sends a shiver down my spine. Does she recognize me? Does she even understand the depths of my obsession, the lengths to which I've gone to remain hidden in plain sight? Or is it merely a trick of the light, a figment of my fevered imagination? I draw back from the window, retreating into the darkness of my own apartment. The weight of my guilt settles heavily on my shoulders. I know that what I'm doing is wrong, that my fixation on her is unhealthy and dangerous. Yet still, I find myself drawn back to the window, drawn back to the quiet sanctuary of apartment 3B. For in those stolen moments of observation, I catch fleeting glimpses of a life that I can never truly be a part of, a life that only exists beyond the confines of my own fractured reality. And so, I continue to watch, to wait, to yearn for a connection that may never come. For in the end, I'm nothing more than the watcher in the shadows, forever bound to the object of my obsession by the invisible threads of desire and regret. Hey everyone, I want to share a story that really shook up me and my boyfriend a couple of years ago. I moved to the UK for university. It was a big move for me, but I needed to get away from my parents' toxic situation back home. My first year at uni was spent in student accommodation, where I met some really awesome people and enjoyed my newfound independence. I didn't meet my boyfriend until later, but life felt good. By my second year, I decided to move into a house with some friends that we rented through the university. It was nice to have our own space and not worry about noise restrictions like we did in our small shared flat the year before. My room was on the ground floor with a window that looked out into a small yard. I'd often go out there to smoke. There was an old, thin wooden door that led to the street where we kept our bins and stuff. The door could only be locked from inside the backyard, so we tied it shut with some string to keep it closed properly. We had neighbors on both sides. On one side were 5 guys who seemed much older than university students. They were a bit strange. One day, there was a police incident involving them. One guy had attacked his flatmates with a kitchen knife and set their kitchen on fire. It was really scary to see one of them covered in cuts and blood. My flatmates and I helped clean him up and gave him a shirt to wear. The police took the guy away who caused all the trouble, but the guy we helped out was odd. He talked nonsense and made unwanted advances toward me. We noticed that he smoked a lot of marijuana, but we tried to be helpful and didn't think much about it at the time. After that incident, I'd see him around sometimes, whenever I was coming home from uni or running errands. He once approached me on the street near a corner shop and tried to start a strange conversation. I felt really uncomfortable and ignored him. He said something creepy like, "I'll wait for you in front of your house so we can talk." I brushed it off as a joke, bought my drink, and headed back home. But as I turned into my street, there he was, with his flatmate sitting on my doorstep. I panicked and called my flatmate to ask him to tell them to leave, but he wasn't home. I waited nervously until they finally left an hour later. I rushed back home, locked the door, and felt relieved. Despite this, things got worse. One day, while smoking in the backyard, I noticed the wooden door was open. The strings we used to keep it closed were cut. I closed the door again and put on a new string, assuming it was just a mistake by one of the flatmates. Those weird neighbors often fought loudly, which disturbed my flatmates and me at night. We got used to it after a while, though. One evening, my boyfriend stayed over, as usual. He woke up suddenly in the middle of the night because of a loud noise and whispering. He woke me up quietly, and we listened in the dark. Suddenly, the wooden door banged open, and we heard footsteps near my window. We froze as we heard the backyard door being shaken, like someone was trying to break in. Thankfully, our curtains were closed, so they couldn't see us. We were ready to dress quickly and escape through the window if they came in. Then we heard my window open some more, and one of the guys spoke in a language that we didn't understand. They were trying to get in. My boyfriend and I jumped out of bed, grabbed my phone, got dressed, and then ran out of the room and out of the house. I called my flatmates and then the police. Luckily, the police station was nearby, and they arrived in less than 5 minutes. I was in shock, and I don't remember much after the police came. They caught one of the guys, but the other escaped. Later on, they found him a few streets away, smoking weed. The police searched their house and found drugs and a huge kitchen knife. It really terrified me to think they were trying to break in with such dangerous intentions. I never did anything to provoke them, so I couldn't understand why they targeted me and my boyfriend. One of them was sentenced to 2 years in prison for carrying a weapon with intent to harm. I moved back home a few months later because I was so scared, and I couldn't stop thinking about what would have happened if my boyfriend hadn't woken up. I'm still coping with the trauma to this day. I often wake up from the slightest noise and have nightmares, but I'm really grateful to have my boyfriend by my side. We talk about it often, which helps me feel better. I spend the nights working as a security officer. My job is to travel around to various buildings, mostly businesses that hire my company for security. I swing by each of these places multiple times at night, ensuring that nothing funny is going on and that the building is secure. Honestly, my job is really boring, as you can imagine. On a night-to-night basis, not much is going on around an office building. I'm required to walk around each entry point to the building, making sure that it's locked and secure. I have keys to all these buildings in case I need to go inside, but in the 3 months working this night shift, I never had to go inside a building. However, that all changed during a shift I had 2 weeks ago. I had reached my 3rd building of the night, which was a smaller 4-story office building. I made my rounds around the perimeter of the building, shining my light up at windows to ensure they were intact and pulling on doors to make sure they were locked. I circled around to the back side of the building, and when I did, I was shocked to see that a door was not only unlocked, but also propped open. I had never had to deal with a situation like this before, and quite frankly, I was nervous to go inside the building. I maneuvered my way through the building, moving very slowly and shining my flashlight into every room and corner. It took me a while, especially since I was nervous. But I made my way through all 4 floors of the building without seeing anything unusual. I made my way back to the door that had been left open, removing the prop from the door and locking it behind me. I continued my rounds, making my way through the rest of the buildings that needed to be checked for the night. I decided to head back over to the office building that I had walked through earlier to make sure that everything was okay. I pulled my truck into the parking lot and began walking around the building, doing rounds once more. To my surprise, the same back exit was once again unlocked and propped open. At this point, I was very confused. There wasn't supposed to be anyone still in the building this late, and there were no lights inside that I could see. I reluctantly entered the office building once again and searched it from top to bottom. This time, I even called out multiple times to see if anyone was there. Once again, I saw and heard nothing unusual during my entire trip throughout the building. I returned to the back exit and saw that the door was now closed. I hadn't unpropped the door when I first entered the building, but now the door was closed, and the brick that had been used to prop it open was nowhere in sight. Again, this was my first time having to enter a building while I had this job, so I was a little scared at this point. I quickly locked the door and hurried back to the safety of my truck. Nobody was supposed to be in that building, so I was relieved that I hadn't ended up seeing anybody during my rounds at the building. It was eerie to me, though, that during both of my searches at the building, somebody had been in there somewhere, evading me and then slipping out the back door without me seeing them. I called the office building the next day, asking if anything important was missing or had been stolen, but nothing they were aware of was gone. I still currently work the security night shift job, but haven't had any nights like that one at the office building since then. Thankfully, I'm retired now, but for a couple of years in my 50s, I worked a night shift in a mall. I was a custodian and would come in to clean once the mall had closed for the night. Most of my nights were spent cleaning up the food court areas as well as taking care of the bathrooms. One night, I was sweeping the floor in the food court area when I heard a fit of coughing coming from somewhere. I looked around the dimly lit food court area but didn't see anyone. A couple of times throughout my years working there, I would discover somebody or a group of people who had hidden in the mall and were doing a challenge of staying there overnight. I didn't see anyone, and I heard no further noises, so I just continued cleaning. If someone was trying to stay in the mall overnight, I'd see them eventually, unless they stayed put in one spot the entire time. About 15 minutes had passed, and I was wiping off tables now. Suddenly, a series of loud bangs startled me. I looked up and saw that a whole table and all the surrounding chairs had been knocked over onto the ground. I walked over to the items on the ground, which had happened near the edge of the food court. There was no one to be seen anywhere. I ventured down away from the food court a bit to see if I could see anyone running away or hiding. I was about to turn around back to the food court when I heard water running inside the women's bathroom. All the bathrooms at the mall had sinks that were motion activated. Someone had to be inside of the bathroom, and I had a feeling that it was going to be the culprit I was looking for from the food court. The sink was still running as I slowly and as quietly as I could entered the bathroom. As I turned the corner into the bathroom, the water abruptly stopped running. There was nobody anywhere to be seen. I checked every stall and still found nothing. I chalked it up to a faulty sensor on the sink and decided that I'd put in a work order for maintenance to fix it. Oddly enough, as I walked away from the bathroom, I heard the sink turn on again. I walked back to the food court, very confused and also a little spooked. I went about the rest of my night as usual, finishing my cleaning duties. A couple of days later, I received an email from maintenance that there had been nothing wrong with the sink sensor and that it was functioning normally. From then on, at least once a week, I would hear the water running from the sink in that bathroom for the rest of the time that I worked at the mall. I just accepted that I wasn't alone in that mall, and I stayed away from that bathroom. I never had any more incidents, though, with the mysterious knocking over of tables and chairs in the food court. Thankfully, that spirit, or whatever it was, stayed in the women's bathroom.